the lab leak theory. And I think that this touches on a little bit of the politicization of science, I guess. There's a lab in Wuhan.
I think it's more Trump derangement syndrome. It didn't allow us to see the forest from the trees. And the same words just said by a different president all of a sudden invokes an investigation.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a COVID laboratory in Wuhan. It is the only one in China. And that's where
it's a virology lab. It's where they study viruses and
but specifically they've studied COVID viruses.
They have, that's a big class of virus. So,
and it's the only one in China, and it's funded by America and China and the WHO.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology. I mean, this is the
Wuhan Institute of Virology was posting job recs 2 years ago for specifically for researchers of bat viruses. We know they were studying bat viruses at this place, and Wuhan just happens to be the place where a novel coronavirus that seems derived from a bat virus, emerges. I mean, what are the odds, right? I mean, this was such an obvious theory, the idea that, COVID might have leaked from this particular lab, and yet we were forbidden from talking about it, I guess, till Donald Trump was out of office. I mean, I think there's really two stories here. One is Chinese culpability, in the spread of the virus. The other one is the media story. Why were we not allowed to have this discussion? Why did the media brand anybody who discussed this leak theory as being some sort of conspiracy theorist or a racist? Why were big tech companies censoring or removing any user-generated content from their sites that were putting forward this theory? Why was the media and big tech doing this? I mean, is it somehow
I can tell you why.
But somehow they were telling us it was more racist to talk about a lab accident than to
David, because the person who could have explained it in a de-escalated, factual way chose to escalate it and be emotional and superficial, and that was Donald Trump. And so I don't think that you could point to us and say we could have changed how the narrative is exploited. All of us are just normal, average people on the ground. But there probably is sort of, a hierarchy of information, and there probably isn't a single individual beyond the president who has access to more information. And so if he was just more moderate and normal and basically said, hey guys, there is a legitimate risk that we need to investigate, because fast forward basically 18 months later, and this president, who is moderate, you can like him or not like him, but he's kind of moderate and unoffensive, says basically that. And now we have this news cycle about investigating something we should have been investigating 18 months ago, just at least to get to the bottom of it, what was going on. But Trump had to make it such a big deal and about himself. And I think that's the takeaway.
But just because Trump says something doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, he is occasionally going to say things that are true. And
that's not what my point is. My point is, as the president of the United States, you just have to have more discipline.
Well, but I think you're right in the sense that the reason this became a forbidden topic is because the media had to act like anything Trump said is untrue or crazy or racist.
It's a failure on both sides then, David. I mean, the media is failing to be independent critical thinkers, and Trump is failing to be a good leader and be clear. And that means you have to be an independent critical thinker.
The media's first obligation here is to the truth. They're not supposed to distort the truth or push forward a false narrative because of the political consequences, and that they didn't want to be seen as helping Trump in any way. And that's really what their motivation was. But I find it equally disturbing that big tech was censoring the truth on this issue. The whole point of having a free marketplace of ideas is so that we can arrive at the truth. And how's that going to be possible when big tech is censoring?
I really disagree with you. I think that the big tech's decision to censor this information was a derivative of the first two things. I don't think that decision would have happened had Trump been normal, and then, media would have just listened and said, okay, maybe there's a chance this guy is right. He's saying and acting in a normal way. Let's go investigate. And then big tech would have basically said, we don't know the truth one way or the other, but it seems legitimate, sane people are on both sides of the issue. So
because Donald Trump published mean tweets, it was okay for big tech, or rather the media, to basically portray the correct theory as a lie and a conspiracy, and it was okay for big tech to engage in censorship on that basis?
What I'm saying is the following. The president of the United States, independent on whoever it is, has a very specific responsibility to be measured, to be unemotional, and to be about the bigger picture. That's what the president of the United States' responsibility is, no matter who holds the office. And then the media's job is to fact check that and hold that person accountable and hold that person in a transparent manner.
Freeberg, yes or no? Is it a viable theory? And then let's get to odds and percentages. I mean, as a scientist, do you think that this is came from a wet market or some accidental exposure, somebody eating bad, or some cross-contamination, a bat and a pig, and then somebody eats the pig? Or do you think somebody from the lab accidentally brought it home with them?
Don't know, doesn't matter. I feel like we need to kind of recognize that bio-warfare, bioterrorism is a real risk. And I think more importantly, that this moment, whether or not it's proven, and it will never be proven or disproven one way or the other, so it really doesn't matter. What will ultimately happen is we are going to kind of become much more cognizant of these sorts of threats to the human population. Let me be very specific. A kid in high school could write up some RNA code today on their computer, order that RNA to be delivered to them by what's called an oligo printing facility, get this RNA, boot it up, turn it into a virus, and they could release that thing into the wild. There are several very cheap, over-the-counter, internet-based ways that one could do this. So the fact that there's some sophisticated government-run lab doing this, I don't think matters as much. What's really compelling in this whole storyline is like, holy shit, this is possible. It's possible that there's either an engineered or discovered virus, and it shows just how if these things leak out and they are infectious and they are transmissible, can become a real risk to the global population. And it's not just viruses. There are other mechanisms of biowarfare that can be printed and created using similar techniques of genomics. There are proteins called prions, and prions cause other proteins to fold in a mismatched way. This is actually what mad cow disease is. It's a prion. It's a protein that you find in the brain. And if you eat this particular protein and ends up in your brain, it causes the other proteins in your brain that match that protein to misfold, and it basically replicates and creates this cascading effect. It's an
so basically like
aliens.
And in fact,
yeah, but I guess my point is, like, whether it's prions or viruses, there are techniques and there are capabilities and instruments now that all humans have access to that theoretically could allow for the booting or the creation and the distribution of truly terrifying tools, biological tools. Now, this comes hand in hand with the incredible optimism and opportunity that these tools present, much like chemical engineering presented in the early 20th century to humanity. We could create things like DDT and kill ourselves, or we could create things like artificial fertilizer and feed ourselves. And so there's this tremendous, as there is with any new technology, this tremendous kind of optimism and fear. And it's going to create, I think, a very powerful debate and narrative over the coming decade on what do we do with these tools? Is it even possible to regulate them? Where is this going to go? And what are the risks? And it's not necessarily just government agencies that we need to kind of be considering here. It's the fact that there's a democratization of this tooling, which is enabling all this great innovation.
Sachs, does it matter if it was leaked or not? Freeberg is saying it doesn't matter, big picture.
Of course it matters.
You disagree with Freeberg.
Of course it matters. And the only reason we don't know conclusively that it came from a lab is because the Chinese government they thwarted the investigation. They wouldn't let the investigators come in. And so the smoke is pouring out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they will not allow the firefighters in because those firefighters come from the West. We could establish the truth of what happened if they would let us talk to the scientists who work at that lab. If they could go.
What would you do about it? Let's say that you find out that it did leak. Yeah.
Well, at a minute. Well, first of all, we're talking about a virus that's killed millions of people across the world. It's cause enormous damage to the economy, to our economy, to economies all over the world. We have to think through carefully what the consequences of this would be, but it matters a lot how the Chinese government handled this. At a minimum, we need to decouple ourselves from China with regard to anything that's a vital American interest. We cannot be dependent on them for the manufacturing of our PPE, for our antibiotics, for our pharmaceuticals. It is insane.
So there's nothing we're going to do. There's nothing we're going to do to China in terms of sanctions if we find out they covered up a leak. If there's an accidental leak and they covered it up, we're not.
There's still a critical supplier.
It acts more as a warning sign for us to do better and be more independent.
It's a principle of escalation. They are still the critical supplier to most of American manufacturing and industry. Every product that American companies make, most products have some sort of Chinese produced input. And
well,
so
I would start with, I think the measured response that's also in our national interest is to reshore any critical components that we need for our pharmaceutical industry. So drug manufacturing and the
so it's not
manufacturing
about
of PPE.
sanctioning China. It's about getting our act together. Chamath, you agree with this? And what do you think? If we did find out that it was in fact a covered up leak, which I think is the most reasonable assumption here, what should we do as America, as a country, global reaction to China?
I agree with Friedberg and David Sachs in parts. There's nothing to do. I think we have to move on. I think it's important to get to the bottom of it. It'll maybe help eliminate some of the politicizing of science that we've seen as a result of this thing. But ultimately, what's done is done. Instead, what I think we have to learn from it is you can't elect hotheads and people who are unpredictable and unreliable to basically be our truth tellers and fact tellers. And if anybody but Donald Trump was the president of the United States in that moment, we probably could have had a chance of getting to the bottom of it when it counted. And whether you support him or not, it doesn't matter. The style made it impossible for anybody to really listen. That to me is the most important takeaway of that moment, which is he does have a responsibility above everybody else's. The second thing is, I think this is the most important macro investing theme that I've seen in my lifetime, which is that globalization as we know it is over. And what Saxipoo just said is what I really believe, which is that you have to onshore and you have to move to a place where you value resiliency over just in time. And if you look at the businesses that need to get built in order to enable resiliency, you will see trillions of dollars of opportunity. And I really, really believe in that. And that's very exciting to me.
So instead of
being anti-China, which I don't think is productive, I think it's better to be pro-America and say, hey, let's just figure out how to build this stuff ourselves. Now, here's the problem, though. When the rubber meets the road, the biggest impediment to onshoring jobs into the United States are the same people on the left who actually claim that there is no upward mobility. And here's why. When you go and you want to basically balkanize supply chains, you are introducing inefficiency. You're also introducing some puts and takes in areas that today have been like third rail issues. For example, the people on the left believe in climate change more than anybody else. But when you explain to them that in order to eliminate hydrocarbons, you actually have to mine critical minerals and metals out of the ground, they're the same people that say no way. Well, you can't have one without the other. And you actually have to have a rational conversation and realize, like, listen, we're going to have to do this. And so, for example, like Biden this past week somewhat capitulated for environmental interests and said, you know what? Yes, climate change is critical, but we're going to try to get them from everywhere else but America. It's not going to work. So that's kind of where like I'm a little frustrated. But those are my two takeaways. Number one is let's just get past China and let's just focus on the United States. And number two is globalization as we know it is done. And we need to focus on resiliency.
Did you guys read the Wall Street Journal piece on the miners who in 2012 were the ones who were clearing essentially bat dung? Yeah. And so this is a really fascinating turn of events that we're starting to know what this lab was doing. If you didn't see the Wall Street Journal story,
we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. But in April 2012, 6 miners fell sick with a mysterious illness after entering the mine to clear bat guano, I guess, is what bat poop, which is supposed to be
a primary source of fertilizer worldwide.
Yeah. So 3 of them died. Chinese scientists from the Wuhan Institute of Virology were called in to investigate after taking samples from bats in the mine, identified several new coronaviruses. Now, unanswered questions about the miner's illness, the viruses found at the site, and the research done with them have elevated into the mainstream an idea once dismissed as a conspiracy theory that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, might have leaked from the lab in Wuhan. I mean, this is just becoming more and more obvious. My gut tells me that our government already knows this, has known it for some time. The 90-day sort of window that they've given the Chinese to kind of give us an answer as to what happened here is window dressing, and then we're going to start the process of becoming more independent from China. Because there's nothing you could do. I mean, how could we retaliate for an accident?
We're not going to get in a war over this. No one's suggesting that. But I think we have to open our eyes to the regime that we're dealing with over in China. And just to add a layer to this analysis, novel coronaviruses are not the only thing coming out of Chinese labs. China is also the number one producer of fentanyl.